All right, we come to what I refer to in the notes as the Book of the 12, better known within the English tradition as the Minor Prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel are referred to as the major prophets for a very simple reason as you've gone through their books, because they have long books. They are major prophets. And we come to the minor prophets, and we come to 12 different prophets that God used to ultimately give us what was in the Hebrew tradition, in the Masoretic tradition, viewed as one book. Obviously, as we take a look at the 12, we recognize, and on the next page, page 19, and I can just almost fit that in for you, that we have the datings of these books that transpire over about 400 years. 400 years from the first of these prophets to the final prophets, the prophet Malachi. And these are 12 different prophets that God raised up during these 400 years. And obviously, within these 400 years, you also have the prophetic ministries and messages and resulting books of the three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, that they come right in the midst of this material that is seen within the 12. And just as toward the end of their life, God leads them, as he did Moses in Deuteronomy, to write down in a book their prophetic messages, the same thing is true of these 12 prophets as well. That it seems the way in which the 12 come together is, first and foremost, we have the individual prophet's ministry, and then toward the end of his life, like a Moses, he did commit that ministry that God had given to him by reflection in writing. And as these writings were finally gathered together, whether by Malachi or God raised up some other individual, we don't know, but within the Hebrew tradition, as you can see, as early as 190 BC, in Ecclesiasticus, that this was already referred to as the 12 prophets. And in the Masoretic tradition, these, what we consider individual books, much like what we've seen within the major prophets, to use that terminology, just as they have a collection of material that comes from throughout their life. We've just seen that with Ezekiel. All right, so over the years of Ezekiel's ministry, from 593 through 571 BC, God directs him during a lifetime of ministry to then reflect and put together his book. And as we have seen, though more precisely than Isaiah and Jeremiah in a chronological sequence, even that book of Ezekiel is not completely chronological. So obviously, chronology is not the issue within the prophets. It is the fact that they are brought together in some kind of a thematic reason is why the text is brought together as it is for us. And the same thing takes place in the book of the 12 prophets. Now, when we come to the 12, we come into an issue of major debate among commentators at the present time. There is a raging debate today on whether we are to read the 12 as one book or as 12 separate books. Now, no one denies the Hebrew tradition. that as we take a look at the Masoretic tradition, the textual tradition that has come to us in Hebrew and in the lists, and as we not only see with Ecclesiasticus in 190 BC, but we come to the 1st century AD in Josephus and in the results of the Council of Jamnia, that we see by the end of the 1st century AD further confirmation that in their lists of Old Testament books that the 12 stands as one book. And so this was definitely the heritage that was within Judaism as Jesus ministered and as the apostles ministered during the 1st century. Roger Beckwith, in his work on the Old Testament canon of the New Testament church, goes back and shows that the canonical understanding of Jesus and the scribes at the time when he ministered, and the early church, at least the early Jewish church, would have considered the what we call the minor prophets to be one book. Now this assumption is under attack today because in two of our Septuagintal manuscripts that have come to us, the 12 are given to us in a little different order than what we have in the Masoretic tradition. Again, the majority of the Septuagintal tradition follows this order, but it is not uniform. And probably around the same time as Ecclesiasticus, 190 BC, somewhere between 190 to 125 BC, is probably where the prophets were being translated into the Greek. And at least in a number of, or two sources that have come to us, the translators varied the order, which has led to a debate about whether, even in 190 BC, this concept of the 12 being one book had really been viewed by the majority of the Jews at that point as being a reality. Or is this something that develops in the Second Temple period, the intertestamental period, and finally does not gel really until we get to the end of the 1st century? Is it or is it not, to be viewed as one book? Now certainly, and I've given you the datings and the names there, we won't go over them, but by the way, when you come to Hebrew exegetical method, when you come to Old Testament introduction, you might remember what the names of the different prophets, meant. Isaiah, the Lord is salvation. Jeremiah, the debate over his name. But then you come to the minor prophets here, and I have listed them for you there with, at this point, our best estimates, because there is great debate, particularly over Joel and Obadiah and Jonah as far as their particular datings are concerned. And even evangelical scholars are all over the map, as I shouldn't say all over the map, all over the calendar as far as when these books might have been written. But I want to get down to the fact that even as we come to these 12, there are some other Old Testament references, and particularly the one in Jeremiah 26, where reference is made back to Micah's ministry and to his prophecy. And it seems at that point that Jeremiah is not just referring to verbal oracles, spoken oracles, but the fact that this has in some way been already written down so that it was available for Jeremiah. And actually Jeremiah speaks about it, but for the religious leaders at the time, they already had a record of what Micah said a couple of generations before Jeremiah. And so this would lead to the assumption that as we do read these books, that even though we talk about, well, in the end, they become one book, it does seem that before the time that they became one book, and I will state that certainly the Jewish tradition as it gelled, and I think very, very early, even though there were some questions, but obviously as you get into Second Temple Judaism, there were questions about numbers of things that we can't say there was a Jewish hegemony, the fact, okay, every Jew, every place within Palestine and within the world accepted exactly the same points as far as the Old Testament and even Old Testament teaching was concerned. That one of the things that has certainly arisen in our study of Second Temple Judaism during the last half century is the fact that there wasn't Judaism as a monolithic whole. There were Judaisms. And of course the New Testament already relates that obviously the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't believe exactly the same things about what was written within the Old Testament. So those of us who've read the New Testament already have no problem recognizing that every last Jewish person wasn't on the same page as far as what was the Old Testament. The Sadducees obviously had a restricted canon compared to the Pharisees, and also we're not on the same page on exactly what the Old Testament taught. So it doesn't bother me that, all right, though the majority opinion certainly was that the book of the 12 was to be viewed as one book and studied as one book. And the same way that as you go through, Ezekiel, you can see, all right, that these come from different times within his life. They are spoken oracles that have been brought together in a written document. That just as Isaiah can say, this is the vision of Isaiah, and again the burden of Isaiah in chapter 2, verse 1, get back again to the statement of the burden, the vision of Isaiah in chapter 13, verse 1, that even within the major prophets that have come to us, you can have places where you have a secondary introduction. Okay, same thing within the 12. So that within this class, we're really going to go both ways. We're going to take a look at the 12 as a whole. We're obviously also going to take a look at the 12 too as individual books, but because of my tendency towards seeing the majority opinion, and I really believe in the end the providential way that he wants us to view these prophets is not just as individual writings, but to think through how they fit within the totality of what went before and went after. And McConville in his work on the prophets says, and not only should you think in terms of the 12 in relationship to what immediately went before and what comes after, the immediate context of the book of the 12, but also remember that in God's providence, the 12 come after Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and don't forget what we've read there as well. That they fit within the same pattern of God's judgments and ultimately God's restoration. Israel's sin, God's judgment, and ultimately God's restoration that is going to come in the future. Now, when we come to the 12 themselves and read them through, and we think in the same way that we do with other works within the canon, we think in terms of, as we read them, what are the major themes? And as we think in terms of the major themes, then what is the overarching structure as far as the book of the 12 is concerned? And I'll use that term. So whenever I say the 12, I'm thinking in terms of the 12 as one book. What is the major theme? And there is universal agreement that though already spoken of, as you can see, by Isaiah and Ezekiel. In Isaiah chapter 13 and Ezekiel 13 and 30, a term that now predominates within the 12. It's already been introduced, but now we see it more extensively used, and that is the term, the day of the Lord. In fact, the second part of the 12, what we call Joel, we can go, if you want to call it the book of Joel, has been referred to as the theologian of the day of the Lord. Because you can see in his 3 chapters in the English tradition, 4 chapters in the Hebrew tradition, 5 times he makes reference to the day of the Lord. But he is, and he might be the one who uses the term most extensively. But we also see the term, as you can see in Amos, we see the term in Obadiah, in Zephaniah, Zechariah, and Malachi. So approximately half of the books of the 12, as individual components, make use of this term. And obviously, as you're reading through, even though the term does not come explicitly before us in Hosea, very early on within the book, you are exposed to this term, and of course you can see it goes all the way through to the very end of the 12. That you come to the last chapter, the last couple of verses of the 12, and Malachi is referring again to the day of the Lord. And significantly, in Zechariah and Malachi, and this is very, very important, the day of the Lord is still coming. And why is that important? Because even if you don't take the 12 as a whole, and obviously the final bringing together of the 12, if it is one book, is post-exilic. But very definitely Zechariah and Malachi are post-exilic. They are prophesying to the remnant of Judah in the land after the return in 537 BC and the construction of the temple in 515 BC, and they are still looking ahead to God's judgments and God's restoration. Now understand that if these post-exilic prophets thought that the day of the Lord was the judgment that had come upon Jerusalem in 586 BC, and the restoration that the prophets had been speaking about previously was the return from the Babylonian captivity, and now they're living beyond those events. If those events were the fulfillment of what the prophets have been speaking about, and in the 12 continue to speak about, they wouldn't still be anticipating the coming judgment and the coming restoration of Israel. And so this is my premillennialism coming out very, very strongly. If it hadn't happened in 450 to 430 BC in the past, it must mean it is still coming in the, you can talk to me, future. All right, you can't look to the past. Now, again, the past might be a pattern. As I said, we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, and yes, the potential was there, but because of Israel's disobedience, there's still not a changed heart at that point. Then the restoration that not only Zechariah and Malachi are talking about, but even the judgment and the restoration that the prophets before them have been talking about is still in the future. And most certainly that restoration, that remnant that returns to the land, ultimately, of course, historically, came to an end in 135 BC with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when basically Jews were no longer allowed by the Romans to live not only in Jerusalem but in Judea. And there is a further dispersion that takes place. And even though a remnant began returning back to the land in the 19th century, and Israel has been reconstructed as a state, as a nation, beginning in 1948, still what the prophets refer to as this worldwide judgment of God upon both Israel and all the nations of the earth that will lead to Israel's restoration to the land and the knowledge of the Lord going to all of the nations has certainly not taken place as we are here this morning either. And so if it has not taken place in the past, then, my brothers, it must take place in the future. And so that is why I am a committed, unrepentant premillennialist before you this morning. And I get millennium because of Revelation chapter 20. If you want to call me a individual who still believes in a future kingdom, a future restoration of national Israel spoken by the Old Testament prophets, that's where I am. But here's the day of the Lord. It's referred to 14 times within the book of the 12. 4 times previously within the prophets, for a total of 18 times. Dr. MacArthur, in his chart, I believe it's on page 1270 of the day of the Lord, adds one more passage from, I believe it's Isaiah chapter 2, but the exact terminology, day of the Lord, it talks about his day when God is going to bring his judgment upon Israel within the future. So here is this day of the Lord. And we need to realize that basically, as you take a look at each one of these passages, the description of the day of the Lord is a day of Yahweh's wrath. In fact, one of the clearest statements of this is in Zephaniah chapter 1. Zephaniah chapter 1, beginning in verse 14. Near is the great day of the Lord, near and coming very quickly. Listen, the day of the Lord. In it the warrior cries out bitterly. And by the way, as you go through the Old Testament prophets, they will see the day of the Lord as imminent. The day of the Lord is near. And you say, well, that was 2,500 years ago, and the day of the Lord still hasn't come. As you get, the last statement of it being in Malachi. And so it is imminent. It is near. Well, it is near in the same way that obviously the book of Revelation spoke about the coming of Christ being near. These things will shortly take place. But we also got to remember that nearness also implies God's calendar, where a day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years as a day. And so as the prophets speak about the nearness, in other words, there's imminency within the Old Testament as well. That as the prophets speak, Joel, Zephaniah, the day of the Lord is near. Now, that doesn't mean it came in their generation, nor the fact that it came with the events of either 722 BC or 586 BC. necessarily. Although there is a tradition, as we'll talk about in just a second, that would hold that there is not one singular day of the Lord, but there are days of the Lord. That this is not so much a date on the calendar as it is a characteristic of when God pours out his judgments at particular times within history that are all prefiguring and anticipating the ultimate pouring out of God's judgment in the future. But look, he says, near is the great day of the Lord. Listen, the day of the Lord. In its, or there in that day, the warrior cries out bitterly. And why does the warrior cry out bitterly? Well, he goes on to speak and describe this day of the Lord. Verse 15, a day of wrath is that day. A day of trouble and distress, a day of destruction and desolation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick battle, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and the high corner towers. Well, Zephaniah gives a pretty precise description here of this day. Wrath, trouble, destruction, desolation, darkness, gloom, clouds, darkness, battle cry. Now, this doesn't sound real positive, does it? This is a day, and when he talks about a day of wrath, is a day of God's wrath, a pouring out of his wrath. And so, verse 17, I will bring distress on men so that they will walk like the blind because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood will be poured out like dust and their flesh like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to deliver them on the day of the Lord's wrath, and all the earth will be devoured in the fire of his jealousy. For he will make a complete end, indeed a terrifying one, of all the inhabitants of the earth. Not is it a day of wrath, of destruction, but it is a day which is going to come upon all flesh, upon all of the earth. It is not just a localized pouring out of God's wrath. It is a worldwide pouring out of God's wrath. Now, as you go through it, I would challenge you to take a look at every one of these passages within its immediate context. And the day of the Lord explicitly refers to the display of God's wrath that will be seen upon the earth. That is going to bring distress upon all men. Now, also within the broader context, we see that after the pouring out of this judgment, God is going to do what for both Israel and the nations? He's going to bring restoration. But that leads into, and I've placed it right here, the interpretive problem, and that is, what is the timing of the day of the Lord? Now, as I said, some of my evangelical, exegetical friends would say, that's not even the question. See, there you are, you premillennialists, you're concerned about the time, when the prophets were concerned about the character. The day of the Lord is not a day on the calendar. It is just speaking about the quality, the characteristic of God's wrath as it comes upon people, as it comes upon Israel, as it comes upon the nations. And so here is the day of the Lord, to use, I think about a year ago, well, it might have been in the last journal, or about a year ago is when I wrote a review of Pryor's work on Joel, our good amillennial covenant brother in Christ that has a lot of valuable things to say within his work. But his definition is, the day of the Lord is any day when God particularly comes to judge. So what are you talking about when? It's not when, it's what. It's what God does. It's the character that is emphasized. And so if, God has been, as we heard in the testimony yesterday, if God, or was it Tuesday, God has been disciplining you and calling you to repentance, then for you, that is a day of the Lord. When God has at least brought a measure of his wrath against you in your life. Now, even Pryor would say, well, yeah, it can be individual, but as you take a look at the Scripture, it is more corporate. But it is any day. It is any time when God uniquely displays his justice, his righteousness, by pouring out his wrath upon sinners. So, of course, in his mind, 722 BC, 586 BC, AD, even AD 30 or 33, when the wrath of God was poured out upon Christ, AD 70 upon Jerusalem, the Holocaust, AD 1939 to 1945, Auschwitz, etc., and maybe even some things that could take place in the future. All of this is the day of the Lord, because it is the character, not the timing. But we would say, okay, even though there is a very definite definition given, still near is that day. That day is coming. As you read the prophets, they conceive of a time when God's wrath is going to be poured out. Well, the question comes then, when is that day? And from the notes you can see. Now, by the way, the day of the Lord, Yom here, does not have a numerical adjective. So if you remember way back to our discussion about Genesis chapter 1, the day of the Lord, as seen within the prophets, is not necessarily a specific 24-hour period of time. Day can be used here within the context of a given period of time. And as you can see, for the majority of dispensational premillennialists, the day is a very long period of time. For the predominant position is that the day of the Lord looks particularly to the time of God's pouring out of wrath, in the time that we refer to as the tribulation, which, as we can see from the New Testament in passages in Thessalonians and in Revelation, is a particular time of the pouring out of the wrath of God. And I realize I wrote wrath pretty small there for you. Okay, does that get wrath to be a little bigger so you can read it? The tribulation, the time of God's wrath. But it is very interesting when you come to the New Testament, and this has its own interpretive issue. But you come over to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10, and again, Peter is speaking here within the context of the day of the Lord being a day of judgment. How intense will be the judgment? But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. And of course, that day, therefore, is looking forward at that point. It is believed to, the pouring out of God's judgments that will bring an end to the present heavens and earth and lead us into the new heaven and earth as given for us in Revelation 21 and 22. Therefore, even though the prevailing emphasis of day within both Old and New Testament is upon its aspects of destruction, that there is another term that is also seen within the Old Testament, and that is the term "in that day." That is then tied in with being also a technical term like the day of the Lord, and when we see "in that day," that refers both to the pouring out of God's wrath, both here before and after the period of restoration, but "in that day" particularly can also refer in context to what takes place in the period of the restoration, what we refer to as the millennium from chapter 20 of Revelation. And this is the majority position, that the day of the Lord is the day of Yahweh's future judgment and blessing. That is both the tribulation and the millennium. And what they would do, as I said, is broaden out not only the day of the Lord. There's universal agreement that the day of the Lord is a technical term. Even those who emphasize the what instead of the when also see it as a technical term. It is a term, again, of God's pouring out of wrath. So that the emphasis just of the character. And of course, we would say that is true from Zephaniah 1 and these other passages. That is the character of the day. But then also it is a day. A day within itself has the implication of chronology of a when this will take place. And so this is the majority position within those who do look and do believe that the day of the Lord has a when component as well. That when is the day of the Lord? Well, the day of the Lord is the tribulation and the millennium, which means the day of the Lord becomes at least 1,007 years. So obviously, day is a long time. Now, I would take that the day of the Lord is a technical term, but I'm not so sure that you can state that "in that day" is of itself a technical term, that every time you see that, it's talking about the same time period. In fact, as you take a look at "in that day" within the prophets, I think you have to take a look at the immediate context. And sometimes it is referring to the day of judgment, past, day of judgment that could be in the future, days of restoration. And so we do see as you go through it, "in that day" is used again and again within the prophets. And yet I would say you've got to take a look within the immediate context to see exactly what day is being spoken of. That phrase in and of itself, "in that day," is not a technical term. And taking that position, that it is not a technical term, there is a second group of premillennial scholars today that would say, no, when you talk about the day of the Lord, you're talking about the day of Yahweh's judgment only. That every time, and it's true, and even those who take position one would say this, you just isolate the day of the Lord by itself. And it's not just Zephaniah chapter 1, but you take a look at every one of the 18 usages of the day of the Lord, and is always speaking about judgments. And that seems to go back to a passage in the book of Exodus that I related to you just a little bit there. Go back to Exodus chapter 32, verse 34. This is at the time of the golden calf. This is the first time after the giving of the Sinaitic Decalogue, where God says that you shall make no idols, the second commandment, that while Moses goes back to Sinai to receive the revelation concerning the tabernacle, remember what was Israel doing down at the base of Sinai? Breaking the Decalogue. Because not only did they make an idol, they also got up and played, which would assume within that also the fact that they were participating in immoral ritual, but particularly they're breaking the first and second commandments, not having the God in preference to Yahweh and not making an idol. They're down doing that, and Moses comes down, smashes the stones that has the Decalogue, and pleads with God to forgive Israel's sin, which he does. But notice in verse 34, go now, lead the people where I told you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I punish, I will punish them for their sin. And the idea that's given here is the same idea that we have given to us by Paul in Romans chapter 2, that there is a sense in which sinners store up wrath for the day of wrath. In other words, there's a day coming when God is going to pour out his judgments upon a generation of Israel, if I could put it this way, for everything that Israel has done in the past. And is going to come a day when he's going to pour out his wrath upon the nations for all that the nations have done in disobeying God. Yeah, and brothers, that's why the tribulation is like no other time period that the world has seen previously or will see afterwards. It's when God is going to say it's kind of like when you're a parent. You know, when finally you snap, and you shouldn't. Just pray to the Lord that you can hold everything in. But, you know, it's like you've had a bad day, and one kid is left at home at nights. You know, you're eating dinner, and he refuses to eat the peas. And it's like this has been building up all day. And so all of a sudden, you're going to eat those. In other words, everything comes on that one kid at that one time. And of course, he's going, what am I doing? Bearing the consequences of all my siblings' sins for the whole day. What did I do to deserve this? Well, you did one thing. You sinned. And, you know, and all the siblings, you know, they've had their day, and Dad has held it in. He has been patient. He's been long-suffering. He has been compassionate and merciful. But finally, the minute comes, and one kid gets it. And he's like, where are my siblings? Why are they all out this evening? And I'm bearing the full brunt of Dad's wrath. Now, I'm sure that has never happened to you growing up or being a parent. But I use that just as a simple illustration that this is what the Bible is speaking about, on the fact, all right, there's a day going to come when I'm going to punish. And it's like God in his long suffering has held everything in, or there's been times when obviously we have seen glimpses of God's wrath. But it's never been the full out, complete and total, universal, here is the wrath of God. By the way, you come to Revelation chapter 6, and the people on the earth recognize what? This is the day of the wrath of the one who sits upon the throne and the Lamb. In other words, that's why they're crying out for the mountains to cover them, because they realize there's nowhere now to hide from God's wrath. Now, even those who take it just to be judgment only, and I would be in that camp. And don't worry, we've got men on the faculty in every one of these three positions I'm giving to you. So good and godly men, wherever you land, there's someone even on the faculty of TMS, who agrees with you. But what is the day? Well, this is the day that sees it and does not bring in that day, sees the day of the Lord as being the day of God's wrath only. Position A within that viewpoint says, all right, there's going to be again the twofold pouring out of God's wrath. Let me just put it up here. That is at the second coming of Christ and at the end of the millennium. That from the passage like Revelation chapter 6 and the passage in 2 Peter chapter 3. Okay, here we've got, we might put it this way, a double aspect of the day of the Lord. Now, in between, that is the millennium, is not the day of the Lord because it's not a time of the pouring out of God's wrath, which is the day of the Lord. And so it is this eschatological event, this twofold eschatological event in the future. And, all right, once we see a twofold event within the future, there have been precursors to that day of the Lord in previous historical events. So I'll put it like that. And, of course, they particularly look at previous historical events like 722 BC, 586 BC, and AD 70. That these were precursors of the coming day of the Lord. And because they are precursors of the ultimate eschatological day, they themselves can be referred to by the prophets as the day of the Lord. As opposed to those who would say, all right, they can, particularly when you take a look at the character of the day of the Lord, these can be foreshadowings. But when the prophets speak of the day of the Lord, they are speaking about the future eschatological event only. And of course, yours truly leans toward position 2B. Just taking a look at the prophets, they're anticipating what God is going to do in the future. And I would go even further as we talk about the Old Testament prophets. They are looking at the pouring out of God's wrath, which we could see biblically, the canon as a whole is looking forward to the establishment of God's kingdom that is tied up to the coming of the king. So this is looking particularly at those events that will take place as God pours out his wrath upon first Israel and then the nations in anticipation to the coming of the king. That's what the Old Testament prophets say. Now, at this point in the Old Testament and reading the Old Testament canon, we don't have a time sequence on this. We don't know how long this day is. The day is imminent. The day is near. The day is certainly coming. And even as I said in Zechariah and Malachi, it's still anticipated. But when we get to Daniel chapter 9, we'll have some idea of when that time period is. When is that time of Jacob's trouble? To use the terminology used by Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 30. When is this time when all of the nations will go through the wrath of God? Well, we'll submit to you when we get to that point that it is Daniel's 70th week. It is that 7-year time period that is then spelled out in more detail when you get to the New Testament, particularly the book of Revelation, where this is the time, this is the day of the pouring out of God's wrath upon the earth. And of course, it's interesting that we'll see, and Revelation goes back to Christ's Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, 25, but it is this, and And Christ very definitely in Matthew chapter 24 ties it in the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. When you see this, let the reader understand, let him flee, because this is the time when God is pouring out his judgment upon Israel. And then, of course, the judgment has already begun in the earlier part of Matthew chapter 24, verses 5 through 14. Now is going to culminate in the great period of tribulation that will be the last 3.5 years of that time period. But there's been a prelude, there's been a beginning of birth pangs, a beginning of that wrath that comes during the first 3.5 years. And that gets into a lot of New Testament eschatology, and this is in the New Testament class. We're back in the Old Testament prophets. What the prophets, at this point, that is the latter prophets, Daniel's not included within the latter prophets, at this point can't put it and do not reveal a chronology. They just do, though, reveal that there's going to be a time when God's wrath is going to be poured out. This future eschatological event. That yes, there can be other times when God's wrath is poured out in the Old Testament and near anticipation of that by the prophets. But when they refer to the day of the Lord, they are looking at this worldwide pouring out of God's wrath, which is going to come in the future as a prelude to his restoration of Israel and his blessing upon the nations. All right, so this is kind of my charting of what I have as a 2. And this is the charting of what in your notes is position 1. All right, back we come. I am not going, we'll get into these passages. I'll just state after the day of the Lord, the rest of the themes, I think by this point you should be able to write these out in your sleep. The sin of Israel and Judah, particularly, foundationally, their idolatry, their spiritual adultery. That, and certainly Hosea as the lead-off batter of the 12, certainly brings that whole imagery again before us. Of course, we've already run into it in the prophets previous to this, passages like Jeremiah chapter 2 and Ezekiel 16 and 20. But flowing from that, and Hosea shows us also in Hosea chapter 4 is the spiritual injustices. I mean, once you break the first 2 commandments of the Decalogue, once that was the experience of Israel and Judah, obviously once you've broken the first 2 commandments, principles of the Decalogue, then the rest follow within their train, including all of the social injustices, murder, adultery, lying, stealing, deceit that is practiced, and dishonoring of father and mother. And really all of the social injustices they rail against flow from the basic sin of idolatry. Because of their sin. And so the same prognosis is brought before us in the 12, as we have seen in the latter prophets before this. God is going to bring his judgments. And Hosea can speak about the judgment that's going to come upon the northern kingdom through Assyria. Habakkuk, one can look for Judah to the judgment that is going to come through the Babylonians. And so obviously the hand of God's judgment that has been seen in the previous prophets is reflected again within the 12. And of course we've already brought this up, that these are only foreshadowings of God's ultimate judgment upon Israel that is going to take place in the day of the Lord. And yet God's judgments, both historically and more importantly, on the ultimate day of the Lord, as God pours out his wrath there is going to be the restoration of Israel and Judah. And of course also, just like the other prophets, we have oracles of judgments against the nations. In fact, one book, Nahum, is devoted particularly to that, the oracle of judgment upon Nineveh, upon the Assyrians. So just as we have sections of oracles of judgments against the nations that are seen in again, the first three of the latter prophets, this is seen within the 12 as well. And yet, I think we need to recognize, particularly when we come to Zechariah chapter 14, which is probably the clearest passage within the 12, that has Zechariah speaks about the judgment that is going to come upon the nations. Zechariah 14:2, I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And then the Lord is going to go and fight against the nations on behalf of Israel. But a little later on in Zechariah 14:16, then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And so Zechariah doesn't see Christ coming, and as he goes and defeats the nations that were surrounding Jerusalem, that this is going to be a total and complete destruction of all of the Gentiles. That there will be those left from the nations who went against Jerusalem. So there's going to be a remnant of Gentiles, remnant of those of the nations, and they are going to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths with Israel. So aren't you glad? I mean, you're not going to be part of that remnant because you're not going to be a Gentile in a literal body, but aren't you glad? I mean, you're going to be there too, I believe. I believe Scripture teaches that we'll be there in our resurrected bodies. And so get ready. Someone says, would you like to be in Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths? And I say, don't need to be there now. I'll be there in the future. That we will also go up and worship the King and celebrate the Feast of Booths as well. Now, that's not, again, what Zechariah is speaking of specifically here. I'm going by application, particularly in the New Testament. Christ tells us as his bride, the church, that we will rule and reign with him. So that means we're going to be here ruling and reigning with the King when this is taking place. Craig.
Why the Feast of Booths? Is that because of its ties to the Exodus?
Well, yes, because Booths remembers how God took care of Israel in the wilderness. That will be a reminder of how God has delivered Israel, has redeemed them, how he's protected them. And of course, the same thing will be true of the Gentiles as well. And of course, even at the time of the New Testament, the great symbols of the feast, as seen in John 7 and 8, were water and light. The pouring out of water, a reminder that God not only fed, but also gave Israel water within the wilderness where there was no water, and also led them by his light. And of course, the God who provided and protected and led in the past is the God who will deliver and protect and guide in the future as well. So, yeah, there's that particular emphasis. Now, obviously, particularly, Booths obviously culminates the feast, the three major feasts of Passover, unleavened bread, and then weeks with the beginning of, or the bringing in of the grain harvest that anticipates the harvest of the olive tree and of the vine, and then obviously Tabernacles is when the complete harvest is brought in and Israel rejoices, and of course it follows the Day of Atonement, the assurance that Israel's sin has been forgiven, as you remember from Leviticus. And of course, all of this is going then to be seen in full experience within the kingdom. But particularly the Exodus, particularly the deliverance, is seen within in Passover rather than booths. Booths is a reminder of how God took care of them in the wilderness and then brought them into the land where they can live in booths without protection, because God is their protector. God is their guide. That was seen within the wilderness, and they live in light of that as they come within the land, and they'll be reminded of that in the kingdom as well. Why are they there? Well, because God protected us. God provides for us. God leads us. So a clear statement of purpose is that Israel, and you can put Israel/Judah's restoration, but remember when the restoration comes, it's all Israel. Restoration will come after the day of the Lord, that is the Lord's day of judgment. Now this is where there has been a tremendous amount of discussion just recently, and that is, all right, if the 12 is a book, is there a structure to the book? Now, taking our cue from the two portions of the 12 that emphasize the day of the Lord, Joel and Zephaniah are the ones who particularly look to this coming day, this day that is near, that is imminent. For Joel, he sees a locust plague and thinks of the day of the Lord. And Zephaniah reflects upon the coming judgment upon the southern kingdom and sees within this an anticipation of the day of the Lord. And both Joel and Zephaniah, toward the end of their portion of the 12, their writing of their prophetic ministry, will also speak of how the day of the Lord will lead to the restoration of God's people. And so the concept of judgment leading to restoration is certainly seen within these two portions that talk about the day of the Lord. So God's wrath, a prelude to God's restoration. Now, before and after that with Hosea, and then with the three prophets who are post-exilic, we have this thrust of, all right, God is judging, and yet God's judging will lead to his ultimate restoration. In fact, the post-exilic prophets, as we get there, will show that the heart of Israel has not changed. The heart of the remnant that has returned is just like the heart of Israel and Judah before the exile, before the captivity, first in Assyria and then in Babylon. And yet God is going to, and presently through what he was doing in not allowing the remnant to prosper, was showing the fact that they are still not being blessed of God, because they are still sinful, and God will deal with their sin in a future day that ultimately will lead to his restoration. So just as Hosea begins historically looking at his generation of the northern kingdom, the generation that was leading up to the Assyrian captivity, just as they are going to reap God's judgment, which will be a prelude to his restoration, so the post-exilic generation is no different than Hosea's generation in reaping God's present judgment that anticipates his future judgment that is going to lead to his restoration. So that for Joel, reading Joel right after Hosea, okay, Hosea is speaking about God bringing judgment because of the nation's sin, anticipating what God is going to do in the future day of the Lord. But as we get into Amos, and then into Obadiah, and after that Habakkuk and Zephaniah, and really, and I should do this, this should extend all the way there. Obviously, that, all right, we see in Amos that as he anticipates the coming judgment upon the northern kingdom, the same judgment that Hosea was speaking about, he begins and ends with the fact that not only is Israel and Judah going to be judged, but so are the nations. In fact, he begins by talking about the Lord roaring from Zion, that is, his judgment that is coming upon the nations, and circles around and finally gets to Judah and then Israel. And including among those nations are Edom. And when you get to the end of Amos, you find out that Edom is representative of the nations that are going to be judged by Yahweh in the future. So for Amos, the particular nation which anticipates the judgment of the nations is Edom. Of course, when you get down to Nahum and then Habakkuk, you find out that along with Edom, and Obadiah also picks that up, is also Nineveh. Now, Nineveh that during Jonah's day repented, and so averted God's judgments. But that repentance is only one generation. A later generation no longer lives in light of that repentance, and so therefore suffers God's judgments. And so we see Jonah and Nahum, as you can see from the brackets, dealing with Nineveh, here where Nineveh's judgment is relented from a time because of their repentance, but then ultimately a further generation is judged. And interestingly, the centerpiece of the 12 is Micah, where we see will be the instrument of judgment upon the northern kingdom and southern kingdom, but ultimately is itself going to be judged in anticipation of God's ultimate establishment through his restorer, through his deliverer that is going to come for Israel and Judah in the future. So that Assyria's judgment, and we might put it this way in Micah, is the guarantee that ultimately God is going to send his king. Micah can see the judgment of Assyria as being, all right, here is the assurance that the king is coming. And it's very interesting because I put Assyria here with chapter 5. Chapter 5 of Micah is not only dealing with the destruction of the Assyrian invader, but also in Micah chapter 5, you should remember this from New Testament, from Matthew chapter 2, that is also in that same chapter a statement of Israel's king, who is going to be the ultimate deliverer, who's going to be born historically where? In Bethlehem of Judea. So that Micah chapter 5 can deal in the same breath with Assyria's destruction and the coming of Israel's king, the destroyer, the guarantor of what God is going to do for his people in the future. And so here we see, and obviously you have to read all of the 12 together at this point, but certainly Micah emphasizes the coming king, who is the key to this deliverance that is going to come. And the judgment upon Assyria as reflective of God's judgment upon the nations, Nineveh and Babylon, and we've already seen in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And remember to get Israel, the mountains of Israel, prepared for the reseeding, the reestablishment of Israel within the land. He's first of all got to deal with Mount Seir. He's first of all got to deal with Edom that comes into the mountains. And so that Edom and Babylon are seen as particularly representative of the Gentile nations, along with, before that, Assyria, that received God's judgment as a prelude to God's restoration. And again, what God is going to do with Babylon historically is again anticipation of what he's ultimately going to do against all the nations in the day of the Lord to establish his kingdom upon the earth. But to have the restoration, you got to have the king, which is going to be the particular burden of Micah. So you can basically see how the 12 begin and end with the fact that God's people, Israel, and the restored post-exilic remnants are sinners under God's judgment, and God will certainly judge, culminating in the day of the Lord to bring his restoration, with Joel and Zephaniah seeing events of their day in anticipation of the fact that the day of the Lord is coming, a day that will both be judgment for Israel and judgment upon the nations, and the nations historically, Assyria, Edom, and Babylon, that experienced God's judgment as a prelude and assurance to God's people that his judgment is going to come, which will bring their restoration, and their restoration will come through the coming king that he will send. Now, you read the 12 and say, sounds like the same thing, therefore, even with the structure. The same thing we've been looking at in the prophets up until this point. So why the 12? Because again, the 12 as they come together into the final book are post-exilic. That as we come to 450 to 430 BC, the anticipation is still the same that you read about in Isaiah from 740 to 680 BC. The truth of God has not changed to Judah during that time. Now, I won't go through all of these, but it's very interesting how one book ends in the way that another book begins. Now, this has to be the providence of God in the fact that, okay, as one author is writing by the Spirit of God, then God leads him to end, as it were, at a point where the next portion of the 12 is going to pick up. For instance, Hosea ends like a wisdom book. Let he who is wise and discerning, take heed to what has been written. Joel begins as a wisdom writer saying, now, pass this on to your sons. Now, we haven't got to the wisdom literature yet, but it's going to be interesting. That's what should be passed on. Son, be wise and discerning, and heed what God is saying. That's the way Hosea ends. That's the way Joel begins. Joel ends with the Lord roaring from Zion. Amos begins with the Lord roaring from Zion. Amos ends with the possession of the remnant of Edom. Obadiah has a prophecy concerning Edom. Obadiah ends with the nations, those who escape in the future. Jonah goes to Nineveh so that its preaching, Nineveh might escape the judgment of God. Jonah ends with anger toward God. Micah begins with the sin and rebellion of Jacob, of Israel, toward God. Micah ends with judgment on the nations. Nahum begins with judgment on Nineveh. Nahum ends with judgment on Nineveh. Habakkuk begins with judgment on Judah. Habakkuk ends with the earth devastated. Zephaniah begins with the earth devastated. Zephaniah ends with the assembly gathered together. Haggai speaks about the fact that you gather, you sow, but you harvest little. Haggai speaks and concentrates upon the nations and their relationship to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Zechariah will begin with the nations and their response to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Zechariah will end speaking of the angel of the Lord, that is the messenger of Yahweh. Malachi's name means my messenger, the messenger who comes from Yahweh. Now has certain commentators say, you look at this and you say, is this just happenstance? So there seems to be some very definite links that lead us to see, all right, the 12 were, just as Isaiah and Jeremiah before them, have some kind of linkage, so that says, all right, think through how they're related, and certainly within context, you all not only want to read the immediate context of the book itself, that is what we call Hosea or Joel, Amos, etc., but what is their context within the 12 as a whole? What comes before? What comes after? I think at least the Word of God has said, now think about a broader context than just the book as a whole. In fact, we're going to get to Jonah and say, well, you just take a look at Jonah as Jonah. What does Jonah mean? All right, but Jonah between Obadiah and Micah might have a very definite meaning. All right, so just put that in the back of your noggin until we get to Jonah. But two resources that are valuable on the Minor Prophets. Now, these are not written as works that say, all right, this is the Minor Prophets as a whole, but these are two valuable works that have tried to resurrect the Minor Prophets for evangelical readers of this generation. Charles Feinberg's individual volume on the Minor Prophets, and Thomas McKinsky edited a work, 3-volume work on the Minor Prophets. These are both very, very valuable resources to have on the Minor Prophets as a whole. And then and again, he didn't take the Book of the 12 approach, but if you'd like to preach it sometimes, James Montgomery Boyce went through the Minor Prophets and preached them. That's the same pulpit where Ryken went through Jeremiah. You got to praise the Lord for 10th Presbyterian in Philadelphia. They might not be the most godly congregation in the country, but I got to say this: they sure appreciate good biblical preaching and the willingness to listen to messages on parts of the Bible that most churches don't listen to. So Boyce's work on the Minor Prophets, if you want someone, an expositor who began in Hosea 1 and preached through Malachi 4 in a congregation week by week, and that's the way he did it. So it has been done. So go and do likewise. Yeah, well. All right. So, and you can add Boyce's work on the Minor Prophets. I don't have it, but I appreciate the fact that he did, Sunday by Sunday, go through and preach the Minor Prophets to his congregation, and then his messages were brought together in that book, and you can take a look at his messages on the Minor Prophets. So this gives you some bibliographic resources on this portion of the Old Testament.